Inside a room that looked more like an abandoned dump, full of flies, with doors and windows shut, and reeking of a foul stench, a young man was sitting at his computer. It seemed like he was playing some kind of game like Minecraft. Yeom-sung-gi was 18 years old and had been in that putrid state for 3 months because he felt betrayed by everyone around him. Someone was knocking on the door, furious, yelling that he was just making excuses to stay isolated playing games. A man was shouting at him from outside, asking when he was going to come out of that room. But he was one of the reasons Yeom-sung-gi didn't want to come out. The man asks the woman to grab a hammer, but she asks Yeom-sung-gi's father to be more patient with the boy. After all, she had moved into the house right after his mother had left. He comforts the woman, who seemed more worried about her own future with the old man than with the boy in the room, pretending to be emotional as she hugs him. Soon the old man suggests they go out for dinner to give his son a bit more time. He asks what she would like, and as opportunistic as she was, the woman makes her move. Meanwhile, Yeom-sung-gi could hear the entire conversation between those two idiots from his room. His phone vibrates on the table, and a message pops up. Someone named Kim Sung-hwan writes saying that Yeom-sung-gi's suspension had been lifted, and that he could now return to school to get beaten up. Well, he was one of the reasons the kid ended up like that. 3 months earlier in a Korean school, a guy raises his fist and lands a blow squarely on someone, sending him flying. The rest of the gang watches and mocks the boy who was getting beaten, but one of them seemed to feel guilty. The boy who had been hit was Yeom-sung-gi, and the gang leader tells him to get up so he can hit him again. Yeom-sung-gi crawls closer and begs Sung-hwan, the very boy who looked uncomfortable, for mercy because they had been friends since elementary school. He looks at his old friend lying on the ground and remembers the past. But he's quickly snapped back when the gang leader asks if he was really friends with a loser like that. So that's why he couldn't hit the kid and acted like a coward, they remark. To protect his reputation, instead of saving a friend, Sung-hwan decides to kick him. He keeps up the act, saying they were never friends. Where had he gotten that stupid idea? Sung-hwan keeps hitting him non-stop. The other two keep fueling the humiliation. Even all bruised and swollen, Yeom-sung-gi speaks again and tells him to never dare call him a friend again. He didn't want to be a loser like Yeom-sung-gi. Back to the present moment, he was still immersed in his game. It really did make sense that he wanted to stay in that continuous isolation. On his screen, the game asks whether he wants to save the HELLCRAFT map. He clicks yes and decides to upload that new map to the game. While it was uploading, he took the chance to review some of the map's features. At least in that world reflected on his monitor, he wasn't betrayed. The young man posted the link to the new map on the game's blog, and soon after, several users sent messages thanking him for that new creation. Lying in bed, Yeom-sung-gi tried to convince himself that that was all he needed. But even though he wanted to believe that staying in his room and creating maps was enough, it wasn't true. In truth, he felt lonely and afraid that if he went out, he'd be betrayed again. After some time asleep, he got up again. Most likely, his father and that woman were already asleep. He went back to the computer to check the reviews on the map he had created. There, more praise followed. Users loved how difficult and well-crafted his maps were. He was happy to know that people liked his work. Suddenly, a new message notification appeared in the corner of his computer screen. That message was a bit puzzling, as it was written like this: "Hello human, I had fun with the game. It really goes toe-to-toe with real hell. Could I speak to you in person to discuss the creation of hell?" Yeom-sung-gi felt like a child was inviting him to a job interview. Besides, how would they talk in person without arranging a location? A deep voice echoed from a shadowy place, saying that finding a human's location would be nothing to him. A snap of fingers followed those words. Suddenly, a fiery portal began to open inside the teenager's bedroom. He looked at that light in shock, thinking his room was on fire. But out of nowhere, a figure started to form amidst the flames, scaring Yeom-sung-gi even more. The demon's deep voice reverberated through the room as he introduced himself. He said he was the master of the 20th hell that was about to be created, and his name was Baphomet. The protagonist let out a sigh. Surely depression and months of isolation had finally driven him insane. He was hallucinating ghosts now. Footsteps were heard as Baphomet approached and lifted him by the arm, saying he was no mere ghost or hallucination. He had come for him to make use of the boy's talent. Yeom-sung-gi was in shock. It was actually real. He broke free from the demon's grip and tried to back away, but Baphomet told him to calm down, because if he didn't, he'd rip out his brain and eat it to absorb his knowledge. Now sitting as if they were in a job interview, the two stared at each other while the boy opened a can of soda. So he was a real demon, the boy asked. And Baphomet said he wasn't just real, he was one of the upper demons, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He drank from the soda can, and Yeom-sung-gi asked if he had seen the HELLCRAFT map he had created. Baphomet said yes, and added that he was impressed by his skills. That map wasn't particularly impressive, yet despite being inescapable, he had made it look like there was still light at the end of the tunnel. a false hope, cleverly designed as traps to torment players. Despite the cruelty, it maintained a certain dignity in its design. Yeom-sung-gai looked at him, thinking he had created the map inspired by his overwhelming resentment. The demon said that hell was starting to run out of space and needed to be expanded quickly, and Baphomet had been chosen to be the master of this new hell. Therefore, he wanted Yeom-sung-gai to be the creator. He wanted this new place to resemble HELLCRAFT, or perhaps be even worse. The boy thought deeply about it, but he had no intention of getting involved with the demon. He just wanted to keep living the way he was now. Amid all that garbage, how could he be satisfied with such a miserable life? Baphomet questioned. He still had one more offer to make. With the projection of a new hell, they'd need to run some tests before the official opening. That bit of information made the boy a bit more interested. So the final proposal was that if he created that hell, he would have free will to imprison any sinner he wanted in it. Those who had betrayed him. Wouldn't he like to send them to a hell of his own creation? It seemed like Yeom-sung-gai had made his decision. Due to his weakness and hatred toward those who had wronged him, he decided he would be the new creator and took the key that was offered to him. If accepting to create a hell meant he could take revenge on those worms, he would do anything. Without a second's hesitation, he grabbed the key as if he had been waiting for that moment all along. Baphomet clasped his hands together, and from that moment on, their contract was sealed. Baphomet asked what kind of hell he would like to create, because to create a hell, 2 essential elements were necessary. The boy asked what those things were. The first was that hell needed to have a crime as its theme, such as the hell of greed, the hell of lies, among others. So he'd have to think of another sin or crime to use. Since greed and lies already existed, he would have to come up with a main theme that involved the people he wanted to punish. And the second rule was that hell had to have an architecture that was inescapable. The purpose of hell was to torture its sinners forever. So if souls managed to escape, that hell would disappear and its owner would face death. In other words, if there was any flaw in the hell created by Yeom-sung-gai, Baphomet would be held responsible. But he had nothing to worry about, the demon replied. If a flaw did appear and he ended up dying, he'd make sure to destroy the young man's soul first. Yeom-sung-gai swallowed hard for a moment. Well, it was time to begin. Baphomet snapped his fingers, and everything around them began to change. The clouds turned red, storm lightning filled the city's sky. One of the bolts struck the young man's house and affected his computer. Gradually, the game on his screen began to change its design. As he used the game to program the new location, the demon's subordinates would be building it in real time. It seemed like everything in Yeom-sung-gai's computer was completely connected to hell. It was time for that human to show what he was capable of. A construction sign was placed, and Baphomet calmly watched it all unfold. He seemed to have really liked that soda. He was drinking one after another. His subordinates looked ready to begin construction. They were just waiting for Yeom-sung-gai's command. An arrow appeared, and the foreman gave the signal to the small minions. They all moved to an area where they started building block by block. Meanwhile, Baphomet observed the human in his room. Since they had made the contract in the human world 7 days, 4 hours and 37 minutes had passed. That human, without even sleeping properly, was creating a magnificent castle at first glance. Was that human special, or was it his hatred that made him special? The demon wondered. He had definitely made a good choice. From Baphomet's screen, he heard Yeom-sung-gai say the project was done. He clapped and congratulated him. The human had created the hell he wanted, faster than expected. Now all that was left was to choose a name. And Yeom-sung-gai replied, saying betrayal. That would be the hell for traitors. On the computer screen, the same question appeared again, one he was already used to. He clicked yes, and the new map, Hell of the Traitors, was saved. He stood up and after so many months, left his room and saw his stepmother in the kitchen. It was time for revenge. Baphomet reminded him that he could only send to the hell he created those who had committed the sin of betrayal. That was one of the conditions for it to work. He had understood, if the conditions weren't met, it wouldn't function. But if the key reacted, it would open the gates of hell and drag all the sinners inside. The young man approached his stepmother, who was distracted taking pictures of her new purse. Well, look who crawled out of his hole. You should take a shower, she said. You stink just like your mother, she added. Yeom-sung-gai looked at the key in his hand. It was a complicated choice. Since hell had been created so recently, there was no way a sin could have been committed in that time frame. He would probably have to wait a few days, but his stepmother kept being vile, asking why he had to come out of the room while she was around. Meanwhile, she was picking which purse photo to post. The more she complained, the more he wanted to send her to his hell right away, because she was definitely scum who deserved to suffer. At 23, his mother had been sold into an arranged marriage between families. Because of that, the poor woman had suffered at the hands of her husband's relatives her entire life. Even so, she always smiled at Yeom-sung-gai whenever he was nearby. Everything had gone wrong. She was probably the one who should have cried the most, yet she kept that smile on her face. Yeom Sung-ji couldn't stand hearing the fights and seeing his mother show up hurt afterward, acting like nothing had happened. But eventually she lost her place at the table. If it had at least been for love, it would have been less infuriating. Being replaced by a younger woman clearly only interested in money. The worst part was that Yeom Sung-gi would hear her bad-mouthing his father to her friends, and the Viper never bothered to hide it, even threatening him. If he didn't want to be kicked out like his mother, he'd better stay quiet. She was nothing but a parasite who wanted to spoil herself at others' expense, even if it meant destroying a family. Yeom Sung-gae remained there, while she grew more and more irritated, so he built up the courage to ask how much she'd be willing to take to leave his father. The woman looked at him confused by the sudden question. He said she didn't have to pretend in front of him. It was obvious she was only with his dad for the money. The stepmother felt insulted by that. Who did that brat think he was? But then he made an unexpected offer. The 100 million won his father had saved for college, and he knew exactly where his father kept the investment notebook. Altogether, it would amount to around 1 billion won. Her eyes lit up with greed as she heard that. If she didn't believe him, he could show her. Still doubtful, the stepmother stood up to follow him and watched as he opened the safe. Up until then, she had only thought about getting a few luxury items she wanted, maybe even a property in her name. But if what Yeom Sung-gae was saying was true, she was set for life. He finished opening the safe, and there they were, gold bars, investment books, and a good amount of cash. To convince her, he took a portion and said that with that money, she could go live her life abroad if she wanted. But something didn't sit right with her. Why was he doing this out of nowhere? Baphomet appeared, amused by the scene. It seemed even a woman like her still had some intuition left. What should they do now to make her accept? Well, it was showtime. Without much effort, Yeom Sung-gae started crying, saying he just wanted his mother to come back. If that woman left, maybe his mother would return. Even the demon was stunned by the boy's performance. He had truly played a strong hand. He really acted like a child, and this was as easy as taking candy from one. She grabbed her purse and started stuffing it with the money. As expected, she fell for it like a clueless duck into a trap. With that, the sin of betrayal against his father was complete. She asked for the bank and card passwords, but he said that wouldn't be necessary, not in the hell she was about to go to. The woman turned to look at him, confused, and the key began to glow. Yeom Sung-gae inserted and turned it. Lightning spread across the room and a door appeared. A sinister click was heard and the door opened. Scaled tentacles appeared out of nowhere and began binding the traitor, dragging her straight to hell as she screamed in despair. But her screams vanished the moment the door closed. Yeom Sung-gae had just sent a living person directly to hell. She landed in a concrete room, completely inescapable. Suddenly, the walls began to close in, making the space tighter and tighter. Baphomet watched everything through his viewer. He asked if Yeom Sung-gae wanted to see, but the boy said he was feeling a bit nauseous. The demon asked if he was feeling guilty about what he'd done, but he was caught off guard when he saw that human laughing. Yeom Sung-gae rushed to put on his school uniform. Having been secluded for so long, he was thinner than expected. The demon stared in disbelief. It hadn't even been an hour since he'd sent that woman to hell, and he was already moving on to his next target. In response, the boy said that as long as the sword was in his hands, he would keep fighting. After all, an empty hell was no hell at all. Doing it for personal satisfaction might be questionable. But in the end, Baphomet had to agree. The screams of the damned are what make hell real, and filling it with more souls would be sophisticated. Yeom Sung-gae zipped up his backpack and got ready to leave. It had been 3 months since he last went to school, and without hesitation, he left home in search of the next sinner. Little by little, the hell of betrayal was growing in population. This was turning out to be more exciting than he'd imagined. Already at school, room 2, row 4, several people looked out the window. Someone joked, asking if it was some kind of celebrity, and they answered, saying Yeom Sung-gae was back. No one could believe what they were seeing. He really was back. But hadn't he dropped out of school? Why did he return? Everyone wondered. However, the real concern was that everyone knew the school gang would go after him again. And as expected, they weren't going to let his return slide. Everyone knew the atmosphere in the room was going to turn bad again. They were anxious to see what would happen, and how his return would affect everything. But Yeom Sung-gae had a different plan in mind for Kim Sung-hwan and his gang. They opened the door with their target already in sight. The idiot really came back, said the leader. They surrounded him, saying he should have warned them he was coming. They would have prepared a warm welcome. Baphomet misunderstood the whole thing, thinking that Yeom Sung-gae was actually popular and a celebrity among the students. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. One of the gang members threw the protagonist's notebook on the ground. He complained, saying that thanks to him, he now had a stain on his school record. If he caused trouble, he had to pay. If you don't want to become entertainment for everyone here, you better come with us quietly, said one of the boys. They all went to the boys' bathroom, around 5 against 1. What a cowardly setup. The annoying one kept whining about his school record. They were trying to put the blame for beating up Yeom Sung-jae on the victim himself, as if Sung Hwan had just been an unlucky guy caught in the middle. Silent as ever, he remained quiet while listening to all that nonsense, and just as expected, the first punch landed straight on his face. That silence was really bothering the big guy. Baphomet watched the events unfold as if it were playing on a cinema screen. So this was what they called cornering the victim. Well, judging by how things are going, it'll be hard to make any of them commit the sin of betrayal, he commented. So what would Yeom Sung-jae do after all? He wiped the blood from his mouth. His goal was obvious, to send them all to hell. As the demon had said, there was no trust between him and the bullies, so he couldn't manipulate a sin of betrayal that involved himself. But humans had always used weapons to take down creatures far bigger than themselves. He just had to use his head. And for this hunt, the most powerful weapon he could use against them was actually pretty simple. The gang laughed at him when they saw him reaching into his pocket, thinking he had brought a knife for self-defense. But to everyone's surprise, he pulled out 5,000 reais. What he would use against the group was the power of money. But there was no reason to try and bribe them. They could just beat him up and take the money afterward. I'll take the beating, that's fine, but it's really unfair for you to do this, he said. Baphomet got excited with the way things were going. Yeom Sung-jae threw the stack of money on the floor. Besides the beating, he had only one request to make. Sung Hwan gritted his teeth and went in for the attack, but was stopped midway. The leader said they should hear him out. After all, there was money involved. Just like the protagonist wanted, they had taken the bait. He bent down and picked up the money, saying that if he managed to hand over 5 grand just like that, then he probably had more where that came from. So what's your request? He asked. He looked at Kim Sung-hwan and said his request was for them to beat him up. Everyone turned to look at the boy from before, who was now in shock. If that amount wasn't enough, he had more in his pocket. Let's destroy Kim Sung-hwan, who betrayed me when we were still friends, said Yeom Sung-jae. His trap was set. It was time for the hunt. A laugh echoed. Maybe this idiot is actually interesting, said the leader. He stuffed the money into his pocket. He congratulated Kim Sung-hwan for his last performance of denial, but it seemed that in the end, the two really were friends. A little act of payback. Consider the next few minutes as just that, he added. The big guy tried to hold the boy, but he dodged his arm. What the hell are you talking about? He tried to defend himself. We were never friends. Why are you trusting scum like Yeom Sung-jae? Scum? We're just taking a bit of money from a friend. What's so hard to understand? The leader answered shamelessly. Kim Sung-hwan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked furiously at the boy on the floor. He grabbed him by the collar, asking who he thought he was to drag him into that mess, and how he had the nerve to do that to a friend. What kind of friend was he even talking about anyway? But then Yeom Sung-jae corrected himself. Since they were childhood friends, it was only fair to go through that horrible experience together. The brown-haired boy got pissed and went to hit the protagonist, but was stopped. Someone grabbed his collar and threw him aside with force. Well, they had been paid to do this. It was time to deliver. He tried to negotiate the price per punch to see how many it would take to add up to 5,000, and Yeom Sung-jae agreed to the idea of 500 reais per punch, which would give around 10 hits. Without waiting even a second more, they started counting the hits while he watched. So this is how people felt watching others get physically humiliated. The sound was softer than what he remembered when he was the one getting beaten. How annoying, he commented. Why did those guys find this so fun? He reached into his pocket for the key, creating conflict within the gang and making them betray each other. It was a very different move from what he did with his stepmother, Baphomet noted. The human prepared to open the portal and called the gang's attention. It was like they'd been stung. They all turned to look at Yeom Sung-jae at once. They asked what he was doing, and the protagonist simply replied that it was time to see how brave they really were. He inserted the key and the portal began to form. He turned around, and the iron door opened. The tentacles appeared again, grabbing them one by one, and all were pulled inside, but one still tried to hold on. But Yeom Sung-jae would show no mercy after all. The leader was known by the other students as a demon. Scenes of what they had done to him flashed through his mind. Every humiliation, every punch, every moment of psychological torment. Now that trash was surely going to feel right at home. He pried off the last finger of the leader holding onto the door, and he was completely devoured. The only one left was Kim Sung-hwan, who trembled like a chihuahua. Yeom Sung-jae turned to face his former friend. Baphomet watched the two boys, intrigued. The protagonist slowly approached while the other backed away in fear. Wasn't he curious about what had just happened, he asked. It might sound unreal, but he had just opened the gates of hell. He'd received the key just a few hours ago. Kim Sung-hwan then asked if he was being spared. At that moment, distant memories of the two from their childhood crossed his mind. Those had been such tender and happy days. He returned to reality, not knowing what the other thought of him now, but despite everything, he still considered him a friend. So that beating he took before, that was enough. Kim Sung-hwan said the other might not believe it, but he had been afraid of those guys too. Hearing that was a relief. They might slowly be able to rebuild the friendship they once had. The protagonist was leaving, but he accidentally dropped the key on the floor. Upon seeing it, Kim Sung-hwan remembered what his friend had said and what that key could do. Without thinking twice, he rushed to the key and picked it up. "You idiot, don't start acting all high and mighty after sending them to beat me up," he said. But when he opened his hand to look at the key, he saw it was just a regular key. Yeom Sung-gi had deliberately dropped his room key. The real one was still in his hand. He had truly lost his chance at redemption, and one more sinner was dragged into the hell of betrayal. Baphomet applauded. That had been quite the show, full of twists, until the very end. But he said the last one wasn't meant to be a trap. It was a test. He truly wanted to give his old friend a chance. The one who had betrayed him was now a rock bottom. Though in hell there wasn't exactly a rock bottom, everyone suffered the same. But still, well, things were about to get boring again. It was time to make hell a bit more chaotic once more. Yeom Sung-gi washed his face, still gradually coming to terms with his new reality. The demon commented that he couldn't figure him out, which intrigued him greatly. When he sent the stepmother to hell, he thought he was some kind of vengeful evil being. But when he saw his classmate, he let his emotions speak, as if he were repulsed by what he'd done. Well, he was the last being who would judge him for that, but some might feel suffocated in a way. Yeom Sung-gi turned off the water and said Baphomet could relax. He wasn't going to let any of that mess with his head. That discomfort he was feeling wasn't because he felt pity or guilt. He felt pathetic for not having erased those traitors from his life sooner, for letting them ruin it. More and more, that human surprised him. Baphomet was thoroughly impressed. He had made the right choice. The sun was setting over the city, and now he was finally home. But he couldn't say everything was in perfect shape. After all, there was a demon with his head sticking out the living room window in a very non-traditional way. It looked like he was watching a man enter the building. As soon as he was sure who it was, the demon announced that Yeom Sung-gi's father had just arrived. The young man remained silent, thinking. Baphomet was very excited to see what the next trap he would set would be, because clearly there was no bond of trust with his father, considering he had been reclusive for almost 6 months. And the money trap wouldn't work, since the money he had used belonged to the old man. Yeom Sung-gi said he didn't intend to use that kind of trap. He knew very well it wouldn't work. They both heard someone opening the door and entering the apartment. Baphomet was practically begging for a spoiler. The door opened slightly. It seemed that Yeom Sung-gi's father owned a small insurance company, and that company had very high premium rates. In other words, he made a living by denying payouts to people who regularly paid for premium insurance. His father arrived and asked who he was talking to. As if it wasn't enough to be locked up in your room playing video games, now you've developed schizophrenia, he said. Looks like you're becoming a failure just like your mother, the old man added. Yeom Sung-gi looked at the key glowing in his pocket and held it up to Baphomet. As he had said before, there was no need to use any trap on his father. Another victim had just been betrayed by that man today. Upon hearing what his son said, the old man prepared to teach him a lesson. But before he could complete the motion of the slap, Yeom Sung-gi activated the portal. He had thought about why his father had abandoned his mother, and why he was always so cruel to his own son. It seemed that his routine of denying people their rights had turned betrayal into a habit. The young man finished turning the key, and the iron gate opened once again. His father was confused by it all. It didn't take much. With just a goodbye, another sinner was being dragged into the hell he had created. The old man pleaded to be let go, but his son replied that where he was going, there was no escape. The gates closed, and the only thing left were faint remnants of screams coming from behind them. Baphomet watched the prison where the man had been sent, but aside from the sounds coming from his screen, silence reigned in the room. Yeom Sung-gi stood up and walked to a picture frame that had fallen on the shelf. It was an old family photo. The demon asked if his revenge was over and what his next plans were. He was very anxious. His revenge was over, and without anyone expecting such a twist, he said it was now time to turn himself in to the police. Already at the station, he told the officers everything he had done, with Baphomet accompanying him. Suddenly a portal opened and one of his subordinates appeared. It seemed that Lucifer wanted to speak to him. It was probably to discuss the new hell that had just been created. He got up and opened the portal so he could go speak with the boss. The castle of the King of Hell appeared, and a council made up of 11 demons was waiting for Baphomet. The doors opened and he entered the grand hall. A smooth voice echoed, saying that now all 12 had arrived. That voice belonged to none other than Lucifer himself, King of Hell. Lucifer was seated on his throne, watching the arrival of the master of the 20th hell. Baphomet looked around the room, wondering why all 12 demons, who normally didn't get along at all, were gathered there. Lucifer asked him to take a seat. He walked to his chair, but before sitting down, He asked for an explanation since he had been the last to arrive, but with no patience whatsoever, the king ordered him to sit. A magic circle opened and Baphomet was pulled down into his seat. Everyone was sitting there because Lucifer had commanded it. No one was there willingly. That was Gargamel, one of the high-ranking demons. It looked like they were going to discuss some new rules about the hells, something none of the demons present were happy about. The king said he had given each of them the opportunity to create their own hell, but as with any contract, at no point did he ever say that each of them would own their own hell. In other words, he never promised that the hell they created would become the official hell. A woman named Lizanne joined the conversation and said that the hells they created would then be their responsibility, but they would not be official hells. Exactly, said Lucifer, and the most interesting part of it all was that none of them had created their hell alone. They had all hired a human of interest to help with the creation. Baphomet thought the others wouldn't have had the same insight he did, but it actually made sense. In the end, the most grandiose hell ever created was the hell of disbelief, planned by Dante, a human. A strange eye began to move, as if it wanted to speak. That was Sadius, another high-ranking demon, and he wanted to know what Master Lucifer had in mind. He answered that it was quite simple. He would choose the best hell to become part of the official hell, and the rest would be exterminated. Everyone was shocked to hear that, and what they feared was true. Lucifer wanted a battle to take place between the creators of those hells. Back at the police station, Yeom Sung-gai was now in the interrogation room. He had gone to the station to create confusion in the investigation and reported the disappearance of his father and stepmother. But not everything went as expected. There had been a report about the disappearance of a group of bullies. Desperate parents were begging for their children to be found. In the end, 6 people had vanished in the same neighborhood in just one day, and he was the only link between all of them. So why hadn't he acted with more caution from the start? Why had he done everything all at once, within just a day or two? Well, the explanation was obvious. Because there was no way they could convict him as guilty. The only connection was between him and the missing people. There wasn't a single living soul who had seen him open the gates of hell, and much less any evidence like weapons or bodies to be found. There are always links between missing people, but the law wasn't simple enough to convict someone based on that alone. Yeom Sung-gai smiled. He would likely be released soon. The junior investigator told his senior that despite everything they tried, they had no evidence against that boy. What were they going to do? An amateur like him couldn't have hidden all the evidence without leaving a single trace like that. Well, in this situation, the only thing they could do was let the boy go, said Detective Chief Park Sang-sik. But before that, he wanted to have one more word with the kid and asked his subordinate to turn off the microphone. He opened the door to the room where Yeom Sung-gai was and apologized for all that happening right after the disappearance of his parents. Park Sang-sik tossed out a bait, saying they weren't doing it because they wanted to. He was convinced the boy hadn't killed anyone. Yeom Sung-gai remained silent. He really hadn't killed anyone, only sent them to hell. He was surprised to hear his own voice, as he was sure he had only thought that, not spoken it. But in front of him, the detective was holding a strange key, just like his own. Park Sang-sik asked if he was surprised. It seemed that Yeom Sung-gai wasn't the only one chosen by a commander from hell. The boy was truly in shock. That was the last thing he'd expected. The detective said he was surprised too, but he didn't expect a confession like that to come so easily. He approached Yeom Sung-gi while the young man was lost in conflicting thoughts. That man's intuition really seemed sharp, and he couldn't tell if he had gotten close knowing something, or if he just took a chance and caught him off guard. But putting all that aside, one thing was certain. As the two stared at each other, Yeom Sung-gai thought that if necessary, he'd just send the guy to hell like the others. Manipulating a sin of betrayal against that detective couldn't be too hard. Suddenly, both were surprised by a portal opening, and Baphomet appeared in the middle of the interrogation. On the other side of the room, another portal opened, and Gargamel made his entrance. Yeom Sung-gi was shocked to see another demon. "Looks like we've met again," said Gargamel. As they could see, the humans the two of them had chosen had ended up crossing paths. The masked demon said it was good they had met again, but that Baphomet should keep better control of his pet, because it seemed his little nerd was ready to open the gates of hell at any moment. The horned demon told his human to stay calm. The games hadn't even begun yet. Yeom Sung-gai asked what was going on. He hadn't expected that there were other humans like him. Baphomet responded, saying he hadn't expected it either, but just like him, it seemed the other demons were also using humans to create their hells, and only one of the 12 created hells would be the winner. Therefore, the game of death would soon begin. Gargamel told the detective to let the boy go for now, because if he were released, he could potentially deal with other opponents, reducing the number of competitors. The detective said he had already been considering letting him go because legally, there was no way to prove the kid's crimes. Besides, he was also using powers from hell, which made him just as much a criminal as Yeom Sung-gai. Baphomet added that they were human after all, and that made them useful. But Gargamel was right. If they started using their powers too early, it would be hard to survive until the end of the game. Well, if they allowed it, Baphomet still had a lot to explain to his human. The detective opened the door and the two of them left together. Sung-gi seemed outraged to learn there were other humans like him. Still in the room, the man holding hands said Park Sang-sik didn't need to worry. His hell was much better than the other two. For now, they just use the others as scapegoats and defeat them when necessary. Park Sang-sik said he'd do whatever it took to survive until the end, because only then would a just society be formed. It was already nighttime by the time Sung-gi got home. He collapsed on his bed, shaken by the fact that the guy had not only discovered his power, but was also a creator of hells. The young man shouted that he could have been arrested, or worse, sent to hell. Baphomet told him to cut the drama since it was the human himself who had chosen to turn himself in to the police. Sung-gi tried to shift the blame, accusing Baphomet of not informing him about other humans like him. But before he could keep whining, the demon grabbed him by the face and slammed him against the wall. Sung-gi had better watch his mouth. He wasn't dealing with just anyone, but with a superior demon who could steal his soul in a blink. The boy swallowed hard, and Baphomet let go of him. The demon was just as angry, because he hadn't known that Lucifer had ordered the other demons to create their own hells too, much less that he'd tell all 12 to fight one another to determine which one was the best. His rage at Lucifer's decision was more than obvious. Sung-gi asked about the game of death, trying to confirm if the goal was simply to survive until the end, and Baphomet asked if the human really thought he was capable of that. But first, the young man needed to learn the rules of the game and what had happened while he was being interrogated at the police station. The demon agreed with him and said he'd show him. He raised 2 fingers to Sung-gi's eyes, making him curse from the pain. Unfortunately, that method of showing was better than explaining. Everything went dark, and then a light appeared. An image of a man began to form in his vision, and out of nowhere Lucifer was in front of him. Sung-gi could see everything happening in full detail, as if he were right there in that moment. Someone raised their hand and said that Lucifer's thirst for war was a great idea. That man was Lamb, the flaming eagle. But in order to prepare, he continued, they needed to know the rules of the game. Lucifer seemed to think about it. What he actually wanted was for the chosen humans to fight and send each other to hell. You don't know the sin tied to each other's hell, just like your humans don't know either. Manipulate your chosen ones and make them set traps to send their opponents here. In other words, it would be a game of tag where you don't know who your enemies are, and the last one standing is the winner, Lamb explained. Lucifer agreed with what that demon had said. That way, they could see which of the hells was truly universal, and how unique a hell created by a human could be. Lamb raised his hand again and asked if there were any other rules besides that, and the king said they couldn't use their own demon powers to help the humans. Any other method was allowed, as long as it was the humans who sent each other to hell. The vision dissolved, and he returned to reality. Now he understood why the game was called the Game of Death, because there was no choice. Even if he wasn't the hunter, someone would come after him eventually. Baphomet agreed, saying that rule applied to him as well. After all, demons are connected to their own hells by contract, meaning, along with the humans, all the demons would cease to exist, except for one. It really was a lot of information to process, but in truth, Sung-gi couldn't care less about Baphomet's life. Even if he ended up in someone else's hell, he would take it as karma coming back to him. There was only one concern in his mind, and he decided to ask Baphomet. What would happen to the people trapped in his hell if he ended up imprisoned in one of his opponent's hells? Well, that answer was simple. They would disappear too. So there was no easy way out. Sung-gi had to give his best, because he didn't want those bastards who were imprisoned to have a peaceful death. Baphomet shivered at those words. The young man he had chosen was insane. He didn't want to survive to save himself, but to ensure that his sinners kept suffering. Ensuring eternal suffering was the essence of hell. There was no way he could let what he had created fall apart like that. Right or wrong, Baphomet was glad to have a human like him by his side. Maybe becoming the master of a new hell wasn't such a distant dream after all. The demon reached out his hand and said he recognized him as his partner, and the two saluted each other. But from afar, it seemed someone was literally watching them. Sadius and his human, Che, were standing on top of a building, observing them from a distance. It seemed the games were really about to begin.